Hey everyone, today I'm breaking down how I made this glowing mushroom animation in Blender, from concept to final render. I'll walk you through my workflow, asset creation, rendering, and my compositing process. I will break this video into a few sections. I will leave the timestamps down below in the description of the video. So let's get started. The entire process started with some concept art, which I don't usually do, but I really wanted to push myself into this direction, trying to translate some concept art into an actual living animation. I really wanted to make this sort of magical mushroom that live in this magical forest and they light up and make all these crazy and cool lighting effects. This is an image that I drew with my tablet and it tries to encompass as good as possible the idea that I had in my mind. As you can see, we have one big mushroom here on the right, surrounded by several smaller mushrooms around it. The mushroom sits on top of a tree trunk surrounded by some moss, and in the background we have some other tree planes with some other mushrooms scattered on them, and everything else in the background is out of focus. And this is how it ended up looking in the end. As you can see, there's a lot of differences between the first concept art and the final animation. This is a normal part of the creative process. It's very likely that you will modify your idea along the way. What I wanted to keep in mind and what I wanted to showcase was this kind of feeling that we are in this magical forest and we have all these cool lights which are lighting up the scene in a very surreal way. I knew from the beginning what would the color palette be in the end. I really wanted to keep and emphasize this sort of greenish aqua color in the image with some specks of yellow. And I ended up using this same idea in the final animation as well, with some minor changes. After having this concept art set in place and having a general idea on how to tackle this issue, I knew that the first thing that I would have to work on was the actual mushroom asset. And like every good 3D artist, I knew that to create a good looking asset, I had to find some good reference first. And this is what I ended up looking for. I centralized a lot of reference images inside of PureRef. I tried to find as many different kind of references to draw from. I used some very wild looking mushrooms like the one that you can see here, the Panellus typicus, which looks pretty close to what I had in my mind already. I knew some glowing bioluminescent mushroom existed already, and I ended up finding some very cool pictures. Some are flat and they grow like horizontally on a tree, some are pointy and have a very large cap and gills. Some are very widely colored. There are blue mushrooms, red mushrooms, violet mushroom. This one, the Mycena interrupta, was one of my favorite ones. I think it looks very cool and I love these translucent bluish shiny details that it has. It almost looks like a jellyfish. I try to replicate it as best as possible in the asset that I created. As you can probably tell already, I combined the idea of this mushroom with this mushroom here, the Panellus typicus. The main idea behind this asset was not to make it photoreal. One important part of this project was to make something that is sort of believable, but also belonging to the realm of fantasy. Before starting the actual making of the asset, I knew that I had to break this object into parts to be able to create it correctly. As you can see here, I created a quick sketch of a generic mushroom. There's a side view, there's a lower bottom view, and then there's a side view with a breakdown on the parts that are more recognizable in the mushroom. We have a cap, we have some gills, which are these ones here. We have this sort of skirt looking part of the mushroom, which is called annulus, and then we have a stem. As you can see, this mushroom looks way closer to some of these mushrooms than other. This is one part of the creative license that I took upon myself. I didn't want to constrain myself to one particular mushroom. I knew I like some of them and I want to replicate that sort of look. When starting to work on this asset, or before starting to work on it, I already knew I would have wanted to have a lot, and I say a lot, of different looking mushrooms in my scene. And I knew from the beginning I could not have cut it with traditional modeling by just poly modeling a bunch of mushrooms and scattering them. For once, because it would have been very time consuming to make a lot of mushrooms that have very different looks to them. In the second place, it would have constrained me just to aesthetic look on those mushrooms. I could not have modified them very easily. If I wanted to make some modification, I would have had to go back drawing board and remade those assets from shape to texture. So as I usually do, and I'm a big advocate for this, I knew I had to go on the procedural way, and specifically using geometry nodes. I started working on this asset in geometry nodes based on this breakdown here. This came very helpful when trying to break down the asset into modular chunks to create separately and put together. This is the first iteration of the mushroom, of the procedural mushroom that I created. As you can see, it's a pretty basic looking mushroom. We have a cap, we have some gills, and we have a stalk. I did not bother to create an annulus for this mushroom because very quickly I realized this sort of setup here would not have worked, so I did not spend any more time on it. I did not like the result very much on this, and neither the customizability on this mushroom. I knew I had to have a lot of customizability for this asset to be able to modify it on the go and to change things around as they see more fit depending on how the scene ends up looking. And this mushroom did not work for that particular cause. As I learned through my experience using Blender and geometry nodes, and as a creative in general, many times it's easier when you want to remake something to start over. Trying to modify something that does not work sometimes can end up costing you way more time than starting over with a fresh mind and some learned lessons. And this is what I did for this particular asset here. This is the second iteration of the mushroom and the final one. This is, as you can see here, it's a widely customizable mushroom asset, which came very handy when creating the final scene. I will not go very in depth into explaining this. Maybe this will be the subject for a separated video. But as you can see, there are 4 main sections in this geometry node setup, which roughly corresponds to the breakdown of the mushroom here. We have a section taking care of the cap, we have a section taking care of the gills, we have a section for the annulus, a section for the stalk, and another section separated by everything else with the spores. Another thing about this animation and about this idea is that I really envisioned from the beginning that I wanted some sort of glowing spores to be sprayed out from the gills of the mushroom. And I created right away a system to do that with simulation nodes. It's a very simple particle system which just displaces them in space in time. As you can see, there are a lot of parameters here to play with. Cap scale, cap height, cap type. We have 3 main caps: a pointy cap, a flat cap, and a round cap. All of these types of caps are affected by these parameters. This is generated on top of a curve, which I can really easily change around, modify. The setup is not perfect by any means. For example, if I do this, or if I push some parameters to extremes, it will break. It does not look right, but I knew I would not have to go this extreme. I already had in mind how to create this, and this setup was for myself. One thing that I recommend other people as well is, if you work by yourself, if you are an independent artist, make things that work for you. Take what you think is useful from what other people tell you, but definitely work for yourself. Try to understand what works for you. Don't try to implement something that somebody tells just because it works for them. Experiment with the workflows of other people and try to incorporate them into your work as best as it fits your workflow. So here I have a rendering that I did with that exact setup. Here you can see the look of the mushrooms, the translucent look of the mushrooms. You can see the glow on the gills. You can see some tiny specks, tiny dots on the surface of the mushroom, which are glowing as well. You can see the glowing spores. Already similar to the first idea that I had in my mind. So we have a dark environment, a dark forest environment with some moss on the ground with some organic matter, and this big mushroom with some little smaller mushrooms growing around it. So once I had my mushroom setup completed, or sort of completed, because nothing in art is ever really done. It's just that you decide to stop at a point. But once I was happy with how my mushroom asset turned out, I started working on the final animated scene. I tried to respect as close as possible the concept art that I created, general composition and general look. This is being the final result. We already have that big mushroom that I mentioned earlier, with some smaller mushrooms scattered around and on the trunk. We have this big trunk here acting as a foreground or front plane, surrounded by some vegetation. And in the background we have some other trees with mushrooms growing on them, and they are out of focus. So this is very close to what I envisioned in my mind. Obviously, as you can see here, in my first concept art there was no snail in the image. I ended up adding these two little snails to sort of bring some more life into this composition, into this animation. This is one of those other things that you decide to do along the way. And in the end, I ended up adding these two snails because I thought, well, let's liven up this composition a bit. Let's also introduce some different colors to the rest of the composition, because these two snails have sort of a more warm, sort of a brownish look to their shell, for example, and I think it would really complement this setup as well. There was another thing that was not envisioned in the concept art, and this is the moon. There was no moon in the beginning. I did not think about it, but while I was working, I thought the background looks a bit too poor. There's just dark and some specks of light, which were the mushrooms. So let's add something else. Let's give the idea that it's actually night. It's not like we're in a cave. It's actually a forest at night. I knew from the beginning I would have to resort to some sort of a technique, some sort of tricks to make it more lightweight, easier to render, easier to work with. I ended up breaking the scene into layers of depth. We have a foreground or a front plane, and we have different planes of background. Foreground, as you can see here, is this whole entire chunk of geometry. There are vegetation, there are the mushroom, the snails. They all belong to this collection here. And by the way, collections are a very useful thing to use when you're dealing with view layers, because you can easily deactivate them or change their settings in a certain view layer, and it will help you when you render out your scene. The background is separated into various chunks. Not all of them are in a particular order. I scattered these procedural mushrooms on both the trunk in the front plane, but also on the tree trunks in the background. Some of them are placed manually, and they are still procedural. I can still go in and change the look. The seed, for example, obviously you'd have to modify a bit the shape to maybe not intersect with other elements. One curious thing that happened while creating the scattering system for the mushrooms on this tree trunk was that the mushrooms ended up scattering on the moss as well. This was not what I intended to do initially, but I sort of liked how it actually ended up looking. In the first preview animations that I created to preview the animation, each layer of the background was rendered as an animated sequence. This cost me a lot of time, combined with motion blur, combined with depth of field, and the noise artifacts. It ended up looking like a mess. So I thought to myself, well, nothing else is happening in the background except some lights or some mushroom turning on. Why don't I just render one frame when the mushrooms are off and one frame when the mushrooms are lighting up, and just animate them in DaVinci Resolve by making some kind of transition? And that saved me in the final end a lot of time, because I only ended up rendering, let's say, 8 background plates compared to 1,000 frames. Huge time savers. Some other things that appear in the scene are these, as I said before, are these snails. These snails are just some assets that I got from Blender kit. Very high quality snail asset. I really loved it. The only thing I did to it was to create a very basic rig. It's nothing too complicated. Some inverse kinematics for moving the eyes, antennas, and the head. The animation on these snails is very simple, as you can see here. The snails in the final animation, as you can see, are sort of reacting to the spores being sprayed on outwards and the mushrooms glowing up. There's a mama snail and there's a baby snail. I thought that would have looked pretty cute on it, but I wanted the smaller snail to feel like it's a bit more curious. As you can see, it moves the tail like a little dog that is getting all excited when it sees some food, you know. There's some sort of wavy movement. This was done again with geometry nodes. It's called wave. It's a wave function. It's basically a wave texture that's displacing this part of the animal. I use geometry nodes very often because it's a very powerful and flexible tool. Let's get to the final step of this process, which is compositing and color grading. The final animation was rendered using EXR, the EXR file format, so each frame was rendered as an EXR image. I chose to use EXRs because compared to PNG or JPGs, it offers much larger and better control over the light and the colors of your rendered frames. I won't bore you with the technical aspects of EXR and why you want to use them. There are plenty of videos out there that explain it much better than I would possibly do, and I encourage you to look out for them because there's a lot, especially for Blender. One special mention that I want to make is about Creative Shrimp and Gleb Alexandrov. In the post-processing of this animation, I actually followed the Blender to Resolve course from Gleb Alexandrov. It's an amazing course that explains in high depth how you can export from Blender and color grade them and post-process them in Resolve. As you can see, these are the various layers of the animation that I imported into Resolve and that I composited together. There are many different layers. We have a foreground layer, which a bunch of additional layers that I rendered afterwards as a correction. These you can safely ignore. What's important is this foreground layer, some adjustment clip that acts only on the background, the moon, which is in the far background, and this background here is a compound clip which has all those background layers that I mentioned earlier. So there's background 4, 3, 2, 1, and here's that technical trick that I talked about animating the turning on effect on the background. It's just 4 plates which are dark in the beginning of the animation, and as we progress, the lit plates basically cross dissolve in. So you can see it here. It might not be too visible because this is not yet color converted. What you're seeing here is the raw result from the EXR, but you can get an idea of how this works. If I play it back, this is just turning on like I would have imagined, like I would have animated in Blender anyway. 8 frames instead of 1000. I think that's a pretty good deal. I would take that any day. This main adjustment clip works on the entire animation from here below. If we go here, here's all the main things that I use to color grade and to give this animation the look that it has in the end. There's a linear to RE. Well, you don't have to care about this, but this kind of node, color space transform, is what you're gonna use to convert EXRs from Rec 709 and a linear gamma to one of the visible gammas that work with your screen. If you take on to the Creative Shrimp course, Blender to Resolve, you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. There's not much going on. There's a bunch of effects. One cool thing that I want to mention is rendering the background the way I did not have to use any depth of field because I just recreated it with Resolve, and Resolve has some pretty good looking lens blur effects, and it did not cost me additional time in rendering, and it did not cause any splotching with the denoising. That's a huge time saver for me, and I can control it in post the way I like, as you can see. And this is the final animation. Basically, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Now, seeing the animation a few weeks after I completed it, would I change anything? Yes, I would. As with anything that you create, if you look at it a few days after, a few weeks after, months, years, you will always find something that you want to change. That's a good thing because it means that you are progressing, that you are evolving, and that you are critical of your own work. At the end of the day, it's you and your creative process and you putting out your ideas for the world to see. This was quite a fun project to work on. I'm especially fond of the fact that I managed to put into an animated sequence one idea that I think I've had since I was a child. I always wanted to make something like this, and I'm very happy that in the end I have the tools and the skills to make it. It's one particularly satisfying and gratifying part of being a 3D artist. If you liked this video, please comment down below. If you have any ideas, any suggestion, comment down below, leave a like. If you want me to make a detailed breakdown on the mushroom asset, I will be glad to do so. Let me know if you'd be interested into something like that. And see you next time. Bye.